morning, everybody. Since I haven't finished the PhD, of course, you're not going to get the end of the story because I've got one more chapter to write. And anyway, if you did get the end of the story, we would indeed be here all night. It is an enormous subject. It's been really interesting because the catoptric system, i.e. the parabolic reflector with the developing lights, has been really completely overlooked, and it's an entire technology that went well on into the 19th and 20th century, because everybody thinks that, in fact, the Fresnel lens took it all over, and believe me, the Fresnel lens didn't. And it's been really fun to do it because absolutely nobody has actually looked at it at all. What I rather hope is that the PhD is due in September. If you pick anything up that you think I haven't understood or I'm being a complete idiot, please tell me. I'm already grateful to Brian Lawton for having done it for me over the Fresnel paper. So, you know, criticism gratefully received. Owing to the fact that PhD titles are rather long, as you can see on the title, I left out the rest of the thing, or the rest of the title. What's that? Oh, can't I just press that? Yeah, thank you. Well, I really just put this on. Deborah Jaffe sent it to me from Florence. And I think it's a very pretty picture to start off with. And it kind of tells you, you know, sunken rocks, the efforts that the Italians were making to keep the Tuscans were keeping their ships safe. So it's really just on because I'm entranced by it. So before any science came into any of this, there were all sorts of haphazard ways of keeping your ship safe, if you could call it safe, because it was all pretty hazardous. So that is a fire basket stuffed on a cliff in Flamborough. That's a wonderful picture of Dungeness, you know, with his great flaring coal fire. And David Stevenson wrote actually about the Isle of May lighthouse, but the description will do just as well for Dungeness. So David Stevenson writes, one of the best coal fires in the kingdom, and 3 men were employed to keep the bonfire burning, so that its inefficiency as a light was not due to any want of outlay in its support, but its appearance was very varying, now shooting up in high flames, again enveloped in dense smoke, and never well when most were hot. Close yours now.
Somebody's got their microphone. Can you mute your microphones, please? Okay. Okay. There's Robert. I think you've got your microphone on. Can you mute that, please? Thank you. Okay. Should be okay now.
Right. So as well as fires, there were also sea marks, of which I went to last weekend in pursuit of Smeaton and discovered this. It's on the North Kent coast, and actually it was a great church. And the parish decided to build a church on a rather less exposed site. And so Trinity House bought the building in 1810. And then the towers blew down in a great storm, and Trinity House, in fact, put those 2 replicas on. And in fact, there's a plaque that says, when the ancient spires were afterwards blown down, the present substitutes were erected to render the towers still sufficiently conspicuous to be useful to navigation. I thought it was a sort of early warning system or a nuclear power station as it loomed out of the mist on Bank Holiday Monday. Well, reflectors had been used. Of course, it's a kind of obvious thing to do. So Cordovan, which is really the first lighthouse of modern times, is beautiful, beautiful Renaissance building. They had such trouble with their coal fire, which burned out all kind of masonry. So they rebuilt the top of it. And as you can see, that triangular thing, I don't know if I can point. Oh, yes, I've got a pointer. My God, how
You use
exciting.
my appears, so yeah.
Do I, right, you can do it. So I don't know if you could, but that is a reflector. But as I'm going to be saying quite a while, keep going on quite a while, actually, the reflectors, they all got sooted up. You can imagine if you've got an open fire, there is your reflector, and in about 20 minutes, it doesn't reflect anything. And so that the lighthouse keepers, where there were reflectors, spent most of their time polishing the reflectors. And oh, thank you. So that the first reflector lights in this country, we think, are in North Shields, and reflectors were put in 1736. And they were big copper plates. They were either 4 foot by 4.5 feet or 6 foot by 6.5 feet. They got quotes for both of them, and Martin Gregory did quite a lot of interesting and amusing work for me, for which I'm very grateful, to try and figure out how big they were and how much they cost from the information that I had. Anyway, they're enormous flat plates, and the idea is that they will intensify, in this case, candlelight, because, of course, there were not only open fires, but in some cases they did use either candles or oil lamps. So that's the sort of end of the beginning, so to speak. And we then get to the first use of parabolic reflectors. And the point about parabolic reflectors, they've been known ever since parabolic reflectors were understood, that they in fact project a parallel beam of light, which is, you can see, a whole lot more useful than flaring coal fires or indeed anything else. And the first person in this country and possibly anywhere to use them was William Hutchinson, who is the dockmaster at Liverpool. And of course, he was responsible for the safety of the shipping in the Mersey. He published, or he started keeping the first ever tide tables. I mean, he is a man of sort of genius. And a whole lot of people have done all the work on the tide tables. So it's been quite fun doing the parabolic reflectors. So here is the first one. And it may look a bit odd with the burner. How do I do this?
Yeah, just.
So with the burner being set well away from the reflector, this is an attempt to prevent the reflector from being sooted up. And it's a very big reflector, but if you put your light there, about 50% of the light is actually not reflected at all, but at least if your surface doesn't get sooted up, it's probably okay, and it's probably a whole lot better than fires. So the reflector is actually 7'6", very big. And he went on and he had put in reflectors in Hoylake on the Mersey in 1764 and Bidston in 1771. And I had the most wonderful fun chasing Hoylake because Robert Stevenson with a V went to see it. And I looked at his notebook in the National Library of Scotland. He kept talking about Alec. I went all over the internet looking for Alec before I woke up in the night and realized that actually it was the phonetic spelling of Hoylake, after which everything fell into place. And Hutchinson, I mean, for lighthouse illumination, this is probably the first, possibly the most important book that's ever been written, in my view. And what's interesting, so it comes out in 1777, and a copy of this is given to Trinity House, because Trinity House is thinking about replacing the rather feeble light at Lowestoft. And Lowestoft is on the easternmost point of England, and of course, all the coal trade comes past it from the northeast. Terribly important light. They also go off and they consult Ezekiel Walker, who is a natural philosopher. He is also putting in a parabolic reflectors at Hunstanton. So there is Lowestoft. It's believed to be the first lighthouse actually built by Trinity House. And that's the upper light. There were a pair of them, and there were leading lights. There's a smaller one lower down. But for all sorts of reasons, they decide not to use the parabolic reflectors as Ezekiel Walker and William Hutchins are using. They have one of their elder brethren, who's obviously rather inventive and does various mechanical things. And he comes up with a completely different idea. And this was the really thrilling thing. I sat in the Senate House Library going, ah, and everybody's saying, shh. Because one of the interesting things about doing this kind of work, I decided that since there were hardly any lighthouses, I would actually look at some of the sort of topographical histories of these places. And somebody called Gillingwater wrote a history of Lowestoft, in which he says, there's a new and exciting reflector in the tower, but I'm not going to tell you about it because it's all been written up in Town and Country magazine for April 1778. The only mistake he made is actually it was August, not April, and the volume was online, and there was the illustration, though there is a copy of it in the Norfolk Record Office, but the one in the Norfolk Record Office doesn't have a description. So there it is, it's installed, and then there was a smaller one fitted in 1778. I'm afraid you are going to have to listen to this, because this is what it's described of in this wonderful periodical. It consists of a glass lantern, as you can see, about 7 feet high and 6 feet in diameter, glazed with the best plate glass. In the center of this lantern is placed upon a frame a large hexagonal reflecting cylinder, 4 feet in height and 3 in diameter. This cylinder is made of copper, the outside of which is covered with a cement, upon which are placed near 4,000 small mirrors, each mirror about an inch square. In the center of this cylinder is fixed a reservoir of oil, which by 6 pipes, passing through the hexagonal divisions of the cylinder, support and convey the oil to a large circular tube, which is placed about 18 inches from the surface of the cylinder, and upon this tube are fixed 126 lamps. Well, I have to tell you, I was sick when I read all this. And this is all about how you prevent your reflecting surface from being sooted up. So this is a rather ingenious version. And what's really interesting is that Trinity House go on using it. So they put one in St Agnes on Scilly, the Caskets off the coast of Alderney, Portland on the south coast, Needles, Hurst, and St Catherine's on the Isle of Wight. So it's successful, and people are very rapturous about it, and it shines, like, you know, people know what it is, very exciting. So 1786, now let's move to Scotland. Scotland is miles behind Trinity House and Britain, England. It's got 6,000 miles of indented coastline, or 11,000 miles if you include the islands. I got all this off Google, of course. And until the 1780s, they only had 2 lighthouses, the Isle of May in the Firth of Forth and Little Cumbria in the Firth of Clyde. And in 1786, so the same year that they're building, Trinity House is building this lovely thing in St Catherine's, 1786, an Act of Parliament is passed which establishes the Commissioners for Northern Lights, and they get a large-ish government loan, and they're allowed to build 4 lighthouses, of which that's Kinnairhead. Well, that didn't cost them too much because the building still existed, but the others, Mull of Kintyre, Island Glass, and North Romsey, of course, had to be built from scratch. But of course, what they're concerned about is what lighting they're going to use. And they, in fact, consult Hutchinson, who is known to build parabolic reflectors, and he advises them to contact Ezekiel Walker at Hunstanton, who has also just built a parabolic reflector. I keep getting muddled with this. Let's go on to Hunstanton. The point about this is that Thomas Smith, who is both the stepfather and the father-in-law of Robert Stevenson of the Lighthouse dynasty, is in fact an established Edinburgh metal worker making lamps and household goods. And he sends them in an unsolicited observations on reflectors with a small model. Well, okay, he's made lamps, and this is a big project, and they're worried. And so they write to Ezekiel Walker, and Walker is paid 50 guineas for instructing Smith, or instructing any person the trustees thought proper to send in the whole of his principles and improvement. I'll say that again. He instructing any person the trustees thought proper to send in the whole of his principles and improvements. And so off goes Thomas Smith, and he learns about parabolic reflectors. He also learns about building lighthouses, which he actually finally doesn't do. They get an architect, because he's a lamp maker, you know, he's not a lighthouse builder. And so he comes back to Scotland. I have to put this in here. I had a wonderful time sending an email to Frank James when I was doing all this, saying, I want you to know that Robert Stevenson is a lying toad. Robert Stevenson, who is indeed a lying toad, writes Ezekiel Walker completely out of the story. And there's sort of a row in the early 19th century, and Ezekiel Walker is doing his best, you know. Anyway, if you read Robert Stevenson, you wouldn't even know that Ezekiel Walker exists. Anyway, so Thomas Smith starts building reflectors, and there are lots of them. So in Kinnaird Head alone, there are 17 of these things spread over 3 tiers. And there are lots of disadvantages to this, though they seem fine compared to what they have had. The mirror pieces fell out, the joints get blackened up, and they are, of course, very smoky. So none of these reflectors are perfect, but they will do for the moment. In fact, I think we've left, there is an Ezekiel Walker reflector as built by Thomas Smith, and there is a cruisy lamp which has got a few feeble bits of cotton floating about in the spout as the wick, and they use whale oil, which is does it not only smell disgusting, but it's thick and horrible, and it freezes in the winter, and it produces a ton of smoke. Anyway, as I say, none of these reflectors are perfect, but they're sort of moving along in the right direction. But in 1787, Trinity House sends a small delegation to look at what's going on in France. They hear that there are better lights there. French lighthouses were then, as now, very beautiful. And the French were really are the great lighthouse illuminators, as you will discover. So they go off and they look at La Eve. There are 2 of them. No, hi, please don't. I don't want to spoil my story. The 2 La Eve lights, and they are lit. Okay, now you can do it. They are lit by these things. They're spherical reflectors, and they're designed by somebody called Tortis Saint-Crins, and they're originally used for street lighting. And they're fine for street lighting because, as you can see, I hope it's my not very wonderful picture, the top bends down and the light is shone onto the immediate surrounds, which is what you would need for street lights, of course. And in fact, they were put in the street lights in many of the cities in France and were very successful. So in 1771, the French Lighthouse Service think that they will install them in the lighthouses. And there is a whole other story in here that I'm not going to tell you, but just take it from me. There is a whole other story about the French being very dissatisfied and they can't see the lights and blah, blah, blah. And Trinity House go to France and they set up a lighting committee. And the lighting committee And this again is absolutely brand new, which is very, sorry to be said. I mean, you've no idea how nice it is working in a field that nobody else is doing at all. Seven Drew Castle. It's Shooters Hill, Blackheath, at 63 feet high above the top of Shooters Hill. And it's got a panoramic view right round London. And they decide that they're going to use it to run lighting trials. They put in a temporary lantern, and each type of light, of which these are the only ones I know. There must have been others, but I don't know what they are. I can't find it. But that's the information that I have. So they have a coal fire, they have that hexagonal reflector we've looked at, they've had the Tortis Saint-Brin reflector, Bengal lights and Argand lamps. This is their first knowledge of the Argand lamp, which is smokeless, and we'll come on to it. And the trials run from February to March. Each light is given 5 nights. And what's really interesting is that they invite the public also to offer up lighting designs if they would like to. And out of this, three ideas from the public emerge. The first one is an idea of using coal gas by John Champion, who's a Bristolian, in fact. And I'm not talking about that because it was a sort of, they did a few tests and it didn't work and they dismissed it immediately. The next one is Thomas Rogers, who's a glass maker, and George Robinson, who is in fact a carriage lamp maker in Longacre, which is of course the centre of the carriage trade in London. They offer spherical, they offer a lens system. Good. So they offer a lens system. So once the 7 Drew trials have concluded, they then move the whole thing down to Portland on the south coast, where they can in fact carry out trials under, under proper coastal conditions. I have to go back 1 minute. You have to remember Bengal lights, which didn't work, but they are very important, as you will see in a minute. So Portland, the Southern Lighthouse, there are 2, and in fact, it's rebuilt in 1789, and it uses plano-convex lenses with Argand lamps. And you can see the profile of the lens. And you can see that, in fact, the lenses are in the lantern windows. That's actually, it's a Robert Stevenson drawing. And the other one, they use the spherical French reflectors and Argand lamps. And as I say, we're going to come on to Argand lamps later. The lenses are a bit of a dead end, but not for a little. And people are always fascinated by them. And they all think that Thomas Rogers did everything. But actually, he, to some extent, did. I mean, the story's more tangled than people think it is. And in fact, William Hutchinson describes the port. This is the only description we have. And he says, Rogers got reflectors blown in one piece of glass to their form, and by a new method, silvered over the convex side without quicksilver, made them very bright, good reflectors, and had what I call a large circular patterned, i.e. Argand, patterned lamp, 3 inches in diameter. Consequently, the wick, 9 inches round, stands at the focus of the reflector, and before it, a plain convex lens, 21 inches in diameter and 5.5 inches thick in the focus, which makes the light answer the principle of the magic lantern, and upon an enlarged scale, it works. And because they're using the Argand lamp, which is smokeless, of course, they can put it in at the right focal place. So they put these lenses in at Portland, which last for a very long time. And they then go on and they put the same system in at Howth Summit Lighthouse in Ireland in 1790. And then they part company. So Robinson stays with Trinity House, and we'll come back to him because he's incredibly important. Rogers goes off to Ireland, and he's contracted by the Revenue Commission of Ireland, which is in charge of the lighthouses, to build a number of lighthouses, all using lenses and spherical blown reflectors. This has got spherical blown reflectors. He's a glass maker. And he builds about 11 lighthouses before he gets sacked by the Revenue Board. And in 1810, George Halpin takes over and all the lenses are replaced. But in the meantime, George Robinson is now in England and is now sort of moving into Trinity House. And he, in fact, puts in lenses at North and South Foreland lighthouses. And what's interesting is that Robinson is using lenses in front of parabolic silvered copper reflectors because he doesn't have the glass blowing skills to blow spherical reflectors, but he can, of course, get lenses ground out, which is what they do.
Hang on a second. I've got a
Yeah, I've got it on too late to go now anyway.
There we go. I'll go back.
I want to go back, yes. No, you're spoiling my story.
Sorry. I had to keep quiet, the crowd quiet.
So North Foreland Lighthouse, so that it's got silver copper parabolic reflectors and ground glass lenses. And actually, North Foreland Lighthouse goes on, still has them in 1834. And in the 1834 parliamentary paper, Thomas Drummond complains and says the mode adopted at North Foreland was a combination of the lens with the reflector, a lens consisting of one solid piece of glass, very thick and very bad. The result of this arrangement was entirely to destroy the effect of the reflector, and in fact was absolutely putting a shade before a very good light. In ordinary cases, the window of the lantern is of thick, clear plate glass, but here, instead of the plate glass, they put a lens in front of each, which destroyed the parallelism of the beam of light from the reflector and entirely injured its effect. And if you look very, very, very carefully, this is the best picture I've made, you can just about see the North Foreland reflectors up in the top of the tower. This aquatinte's about 1823. So the lenses, they go. I mean, Fresnel, as you all know, Fresnel gets the lenses right, but these early experiments are quite interesting, but they do not work. And then the catoptric system arrives, so that I've been coming up to this. The catoptric system, as I think I said earlier, is a combination of a silvered copper parabolic reflector with a smokeless Argand lamp that you can put in the right focal point because it's smokeless. And actually, it's a brilliant system and it works perfectly well, and it goes on working well for many, 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 many more decades than most people think, which has been really fun finding all this stuff out. And catoptric means reflectors. If we're being really sort of nerdy, dioptric, which is Fresnel, means refracting. And being ultra nerdy, catadioptric, which is what Fresnel eventually gets to, is the totally internally reflecting prism in which it's both refracting and reflecting, but that's slightly another story. Catoptric is, as I say, a parabolic reflector with a smokeless Argand lamp. Here's the next, if you can cast your mind back. So there are three ideas that come out of Seven Droog, those lighting trials: gas, which doesn't work; lenses, which look okay and ultimately don't work; and the third one is the idea of the catoptric system, and it's introduced by Adam Walker, and it's Adam Walker who sells or Trinity House or offers Trinity House the idea of using Bengal lights for lighthouse illumination. Is this how they know him, or is he just famous? He was a very well-known natural philosopher and lecturer. as you can see from, I think, this rather funny cartoon. And, you know, he gives evidence on broad wheels on turnpike roads, you know, a little earlier than this. He builds a giant orrery. You know, he's a classic sort of late 18th century natural philosopher. And he tells Trinity House that there is a new lighting system in France that they should look at. And the new lighting system is the parabolic silver copper reflector with the Argand lamp, which was first used in Cordoue in 1790. But of course, this is a little before 1790. Presumably, Walker has contacts in France and knows what's going on. And they are absolutely beautiful. They're big. They're about 36 inches. There is Cordoue with the top of its Renaissance, the upper part of the Renaissance tower chopped off and a more conventional lighthouse tower put in. And this is, you know, together with the Fresnel lens, you know, one of the great lighthouse illumination breakthroughs. And I dragged James, when he was rather old and sort of creaky, I dragged him to an island an hour and a half by boat off the west coast of Brittany to see this lighthouse museum with all this stuff in it that was opened, you know, on the first Thursday after the full moon. It was quite an adventure, but we got there. So the lighting committee go and see him. And the other thing about this is that it revolves. All the lighthouses that you know, in Britain were in fact fixed. There was an early example of a moving light in Sweden, but it moved rather than, as it were, revolved. So this revolves. And as I say, it's combined with the smokeless Argand lamp, which you can then make sure that you get the maximum reflection from your reflector, and it is the perfect marriage. And what makes it possible is the Argand lamp. And there's a whole story to this. What you really need to know is that the Argand lamp was the most revolutionary advance in lighting technology ever. If you think back to that grotty little cruisy lamp, everybody's using horrid little oil lamps, and they smoke like hell, and you know, and they smell, and they freeze in the winter, etc. And as I'm sure you all know perfectly well, I'm sure much better than me, Argand comes up with the idea of a tubular wick, and it provides a current of air into the middle of the flame, which of course increases combustion. And then a little later, the chimney is added to increase the draft. And James Timmins Chance, who's the great lighthouse manufacturer of the late 19th century, writes, "The chimney that was essential to perfect combustion served likewise the indispensable purpose of carrying off the gaseous products, which in previous forms of lamp, by tarnishing the surface of a reflector, rendered its adoption quite futile." You get the point. And the catoptric system dominates lighthouse illumination in Great Britain long after the introduction of the Fresnel lens, which I know I've said several times. So the first one that's put in this country is at St Agnes Scilly, and although that's rather charming, 16th century, actually the lighthouse, apart from the top, still looks like that. And its coal-fire had been replaced by a Michael James hexagonal reflector in 1783, and in 1790 they decide to replace it with a revolving catoptric light, and it's the first British revolving light. Very successful. And there's a whole sub-story. There's a sub-story to all of this sort of stuff, but it's not really lecturable about because it's all rather detailed. But anyway, of course, one of the reasons they decide that they want to put this kind of light on St Agnes Scilly is that people kept muddling up the Scilly light with the Eddystone, so that, you know, there were endless wrecks and one thing. So that this is absolutely to make it obvious that it is not the Eddystone, which has got candles. And the apparatus It's designed by Adam Walker, and it's built by George Robinson, who's been in partnership with Thomas Rogers and comes to Trinity House's attention in 1788 with the trials. And he, in 1791, he's appointed their superintendent of lights, and he runs this fantastically successful practice. He goes on making lamps, so he goes on having a sort of carriage trade thing, but he manufactures all the reflecting and lamps for the whole of Trinity House. And he goes into partnership with somebody who's better, who in fact it develops the lamps. And the firm goes on well into the 1850s. The killer is that his name is George Robinson. And I've discovered quite a lot about him, but you know, you run George Robinson through Ancestry and you get 10 million entries, but I'm sort of working on it. So that's silly. And then we have Happisburgh or Haysborough. How you spell it and how you pronounce it, it sort of depends on what part of the country you live in. Trinity House spells it a million different ways. But that's the first light in Britain that's in fact built specifically to take a catoptric light. It's not being replaced by anything. It's brand new, and it's got this brand new catoptric light, the first fixed light, catoptric light in Britain. And in a sense, this is a sort of conclusion of the first period. And there we are. So you see all the fixed, the revolving lights more fixed than revolving, because I think they find it easier to manage and they're less expensive. And then the private lights, all do fixed. And George Robinson is making all, I mean, he is a business that's doing amazingly. And sadly, what I did discover is that his son was drowned going off to fit in a catoptric system to Flat Home Lighthouse down the road. I haven't in this list included either Scotland or Ireland. Ireland, they both start much later, and Ireland starts building catoptric lights in 1812, many of them built by Robinson, and they follow the Trinity House pattern. And of course, Scotland, having had its Act of Parliament, the Northern Lighthouse Board is entirely responsible for Scottish lights. It doesn't have private lights. It doesn't have the complications of being an old institution like Trinity House. It's brand new from 1786. And of course, they have, first of all, Thomas Smith, and then they have Robert Stevenson, and then they have Alan and Thomas and David, and then all the generations right down to D. Alan Stevenson, who in fact, I think dies in the late 50s, but he was the last of them. So they have a dynasty that lasts 150-ish years. And I'm partly not into, because Stevenson goes in a sort of different way. I mean, he's, wants to be different. He has elements of Brunel about him, I think. And the Eddystone, you can see, this is from the Edinburgh Encyclopedia, the Eddystone, clearly that tier of 24 enormous candles works perfectly well for a jolly long time, and it doesn't get converted till 1810 to a catoptric system by George Robinson. And actually, you can just see the sort of arrangement of, it's got, I've said it. Gosh, that's the thing about you put it all on your slides, you don't have to remember. 24 reflectors arranged in tiers. And by this time, the English reflector sizes are standardized. They're 21 inches deep, 21 inches in diameter and 9 inches deep. So Scotland lags behind. I mean, they have to get government loans to build those lighthouses. And although they keep applying, they're always slightly short of money. And also Thomas Smith, who in fact runs the firm that is providing the lamps, and after a while, I think also providing the reflectors, is rather, and I'm sorry to sound mean and horrible about the Smiths and the Stevensons, but honestly, this early generation come out as not being very generous. So Thomas Smith is wedded to the faceted mirrors and cruisy lamps, and does them perfectly well. And I think that there's one of the reasons that they don't build so many lighthouses in Scotland for quite a while, is that actually, you know, Greenside, the Greenside company, which is Thomas Smith's company, is actually doing, you know, I think charging them through the nose. It's quite interesting, all of this, but it's a sub-story. So while Trinity House is building all these catoptric lights, 1793, they build a new lighthouse in Little Cumberry, and it's lit with 36 old-style reflectors. So there's rather sort of weird-looking ones with lots of mirrors. In 1794, they build 2 sets of lights on Pentland Skerries, and they have 33 in each tower. So, you know, all this, each reflector costs whatever. So they've gone, I think, they've sort of gone over the top on all of this. And interestingly, Robert Stevenson later says about the lighthouse keeper on Pentland Skerries with 2 lighthouses with 33 reflectors in each one. He says that, in fact, the lighthouse keeper gave unremitting attention to his charge. The hand of care and industrious application is visible in every part of his duty, and though in almost every respect his work is double any of the other keepers, yet he is behind in nothing. The 2 lanterns, the 66 reflectors, the 600 panes of lantern glass, etc. I don't think you want to be a lighthouse keeper on Pentland Skerries, certainly. But anyway, in 1801, Robert Stevenson goes on a voyage. He goes on a research trip, effectively, to the English coast. And he comes back and he is completely converted to the idea of the parabolic silvered copper reflector. And what he says is the first Northern Lights reflectors were parabolic, but their powers were small from their reflecting surfaces being composed of facets of silvered mirror glass, and 1 point only of each facet coinciding with the curve of the parabola. As many of the rays are thus lost or weakened by transmission through the glass of the reflector, the light is much less brilliant than when reflected from a metallic speculum of a uniform parabolic figure of a more white and dense body, such as silver. Well, that is Robert Stevenson on why, and it's a very nice piece of writing, on why the silvered copper parabolic reflector is head and shoulders better than all those nasty little bits of mirror glass. So Inchkeith is built and lit in 1804. The first one built by Trinity House is 1790. So it's a lot. Scotland is a long way behind at this point. Inchkeith built from scratch, first catoptric light in Scotland. It's fixed, beautiful. Of course, they have this wonderful eye for building, beautiful, beautiful. And although everybody bangs on about the Bell Rock, of course they do, in terms of lighting, this lighthouse, the Inchkeith Lighthouse, is 1,000,000 times more important than the Bell Rock, because it establishes for everybody to see that this system, the catoptric system, is much better than anything else, and it's accepted by the commissioners of the Northern Lights. And in fact, the reflectors are made by Robinson and also by a Quaker manufacturer in London called Robert Howard. And it was different. I mean, George Robinson, who was clearly impossibly overstretched, was about 8 months behind providing the reflectors. And in fact, there are these incredibly grouchy letters from Robert Stevenson. And he never uses Robinson again. So the next one, that's 1804. I'm going back, I don't go back, I don't go forward, thank you. That's Start Point Lighthouse in Sandy on Orkneys at 1806, and that's the first revolving catoptric. It's not only is it the first revolving light in Scotland, it's the first catoptric revolving site in Scotland, and I don't know who made the apparatus. All I do know is that it wasn't Robinson, with whom he did finally fall out catastrophically. And then, of course, we get, is it this one? The Bell Rock. I mean, naturally, one has to mention the Bell Rock, which is because Stevenson is using Start Point as a kind of test bed, and this is really the point I haven't got to in the thesis. I've just written it up and it isn't illustratable actually, about, you know, I'm slightly ahead of myself. He's using he's using Sanday for also to try out coloured glass, which I'm going to come on to eventually. He's thinking about how he can best do it. And so after, and the other point about the Bell Rock is that actually I do know who made the equipment, and they were silvered copper sheets made by the Bolton Plate Company. And I've spent very happy hours in the Bolton and Watt collection because there's this vast amount of correspondence. So they, in fact, sent up big plates, and at Thomas Smith's Greenside works, they were then hammered into shape over a kind of mould. And there's a whole new and exciting story to be told in there. Well, now you've got lots of lighthouses. Well, that throws up a problem. Oh, sorry, that's the last Isle of May. That's the last Scottish coal light, and it's built with a fixed catoptric system, as you can see, in 1816. I don't quite know why I keep skipping. I'm going too fast. Anyway, so there are all these lights, and now it's getting to be a real problem about which one is which. And as Alan Stevenson wrote later, the great advantage derived by seamen from the establishment of lights on a coast soon makes the calls for additional lights so frequent that their very number itself produces a new evil in the difficulty of distinguishing the lights from each other. Well, originally, mariners really only had to differentiate between those sort of, you know, sweep lights, fires in baskets, fires on towers. They had to be jolly careful because, of course, there were fire lights from lime kilns on the coast. And one of the reasons the Bell Rock got built is there was a catastrophic wreck, 2 ships, which thought that they were heading for, I've now forgotten what, but they hit a lime, they mistook the light of a lime kiln on the Fife coast. So you needed some way of distinguishing. And it was, of course, when fixed parabolic reflectors came in, things got easier, because it's much easier to know that you're looking at a fixed beam, sort of like this, than it is, you know, looking at some grotty fire and wondering where on earth you are. But, of course, it's much easier to distinguish revolving lights because you can time the revolutions. And the other thing about revolving lights is they produce a brighter beam. I mean, I don't understand enough about optics to know why, but they produce 450 is against 350 times the effect of an unreflective flame. And the different types of revolving beams are actually produced by different types of frames. I think this is really interesting, but you don't have to. So Trinity House, they use a triangular frame. And you can tell because all the reflectors are in odd numbers, usually 5 or 7, arranged as you can see, 131 or whatever it is, 232. And you get quite a distinct moment of darkness simply because you've got gaps between the two, you know, between the lines of reflector. So you get the light, and then you've got a very distinctive moment of darkness. And the Irish also use triangular lights because they follow the Trinity House pattern. Robert Stevenson is looking for other solutions. So he sends his employee, John Forrest, off to snoop around up in the north of England. And he goes to the Outer Farm Island Lighthouse, which is a circular frame built by George Robinson for private owners. And the point about circular frames and you can see then Inchkeith, which is converted from fixed to revolving in 1816, has a very similar arrangement. And of course, circular frames like this with the reflectors set contiguously, they don't have a distinctive period of darkness. They wax and wane. And the reason, of course, they wax and wane is because the divergence from a parabolic is, is all over. So if you've got your reflectors side by side, the divergence from each one sort of mixes. So you get a waxing and waning effect as against light and dark. And then Robert Stevenson, the Bell Rock Lighthouse, he does something completely different. So that in fact, he's using a rectangular frame, and you can both see the lower tier and then the upper tiers. And he is also using coloured glass, so he's using red glass on the short sides. And it's quite difficult to figure out what it actually looks like when it starts revolving. It's rectangular, which seems to me rather counterproductive, but how would I know? I think that there must have been a more definitive moment of darkness than there would be on a circular frame. Anyway, he also says he wouldn't he? It's the most powerful and brilliant light upon the coast. This arises chiefly from the greater dimensions of the reflectors. He's using 25-inch reflectors, and from their particular arrangement. And there it is in the lantern. He then goes on to build Corsewall Lighthouse, also this time Corsewall, he goes back to using a circular frame, and this is again on tiers, so that I expect you can read, the plan of the lightroom showing first and third tiers, and then the second tier of the reflector, and so that in fact the thing is set quite interestingly, and there on the left you can see the reflectors actually on their frame. And this was the moment I began to get in a muddle, because I'm talking about frames, but I'm also talking about coloured lights, which is as much as I'm going to go this evening, because as I say, I haven't really got to the part of this where I can, lecture on it. The first place to use colour is Flamborough. Trinity House light, built by George Robinson, and it's the first light in the world, as far as I know, certainly the first light in this country, to use coloured glass plates in front of the reflectors. It's on a triangular frame, so that it's doing all the things that it's got power of. And then I think one of the frames has got red, so you've got red and then 2 white, and the thing turns. And they had the most terrible time finding anybody that can make red glass. And actually, this is more fun to write up than just to talk about, but Robert Stevenson was clearly the client from hell, because he's hounding the only man that can make these things, and is constantly nipping at his heels. And the poor man's having to put in all sorts of new and exciting kit to make red glass plates that are 25 inches in diameter. So they're big. The other interesting thing about Flamborough is that actually George Robinson is putting lenses in front of the lamps, I assume to intensify the light, to try and get it through the red glass. And he is, of course, a carriage lamp maker, and so they do very often have a lens in front of the lamp. But that's really new, and I've only just come across that. Anyway, I think this is nearly there. By 1834, there were several categories of distinguishing lights, all of which were written up in the guides, that the Mariner's Guides to the British Forest, which actually Alan Stevenson wrote. So you've got fixed, revolving white, revolving red and white, flashing, intermittent, leading, and double revolving lights. And I'm not going to describe all of them, just take it from me, they exist. And if you're on some hideous boat tossing about on the waves, you, in theory, know which is which from your directory, don't you? Anyway, as I say, the umpteenth time, the catoptric system survived in parallel with the Fresnel lenses for decades. They're not perfect. They're cheap. They're easy to maintain. You can place the light in the correct focus. they had a lot of trouble with that in this country with the Fresnel lens. They couldn't, it took them until the 1860s really to figure out where the lamp ought to be in relationship to the prisms, so that these things go on working perfectly well. They hung on, of course, for light ships. I mean, you're not going to spend millions on a Fresnel lens for a light ship when you can do this. They're all quite small, but there are lots of them around, or there were. And I sort of rest my case here because the last catoptric light that was still working in this country was Walney Island, and it was only taken out of service in 2003. So this is a completely hidden technology that actually hung on and hung on and hung on and was so well known and so common that in a sense, people stopped commenting on it because the Fresnel lens is very beautiful and very effective and looks marvelous. And yes, it's great. But, you know, this is a kind of workaday technology and it really worked. And I think that's more or less where I've got to.
Thank you, Julia. Right, there was quite a few messages coming through or comments as we were going through. So what I will do, I will call those up onto the screen if I can. Lost them there. Where's the chat gone? There it is. Go back up to the top. There's a comment there. If I just go through these, obviously you can comment as necessary. These were coming up as you got to various slides, so some of them relate to specific slides. The far low LISO appears to be at the focus of the parabola, which is necessary to obtain a parallel beam. Does that make sense?
Well, you can get a parallel beam to some extent, but it's not nearly as effective. You know, if you have your reflector, if you have your burner slightly outside the main body of the reflector, you will get some reflected light and some effect of a parallel beam, but it isn't perfect. As I say, it was the smoky problem. I mean, and of course, because they're silvered, you know, they've got lots of little joints, and the little joints all go black. I mean, it wasn't great, but it was a whole lot better than they'd had before.
The next comment was what oil was used in the 18th century. You mentioned whale oil being used in the early 90s.
They used whale oil, they used pale seal oil. By the 1780s, they're using spermaceti oil. And spermaceti oil is the perfect oil. It smells sweet. It doesn't freeze in the winter. It burns very brightly. I mean, it is a miracle oil. And in fact, what I did throw into my PhD, because I thought it was fun, there's a wonderful description in Moby Dick. And Moby Dick was a sperm whale of Tash Tego falling into the head where all the spermaceti oil is in the whale's head and swimming about. And Melville says, a sweeter death than this could hardly be imagined unless you fell into a hive of honey. I mean, so, and it does say everything about spermaceti oil, and it was so popular and everybody used it that by the 1840s, the sperm whales had almost been fished out because the oil was so badly needed for lighting. And in the very nick of time, the man whose name I can't remember invented paraffin oil. James, whatever his name is, somebody will remember. Somebody came along and invented paraffin oil, and there are very nice cartoons in America of the sperm whale balls, of which the sperm whales were all dressed in white tailcoats, celebrating the arrival of mineral oil or paraffin oil. The French didn't use it. The French actually used rapeseed oil for all their lighthouses. But I mean, Britain's a maritime nation, and clearly whale, which must have been horrible, and pale seal oil. And Robert Stevens, they're endlessly doing tests on the oils. That is a whole paper in itself, actually.
There's another question here from John New. Portland, well, comment really. Portland has had 3 lighthouses at the bill.
Yes, it has. I mean, it has, absolutely. I mean, one I never can remember. I mean, I can, it's all written down, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. I mean, lots of these lighthouses were in fact eventually replaced, or they were moved somewhere else. In fact, the Southern Lighthouse was itself a replacement of 1789 for an earlier light, which was deemed to be in the wrong place.
There's a comment here. You mentioned John Champion at one point,
Yes.
coming up with a light from Bristol. Was that Champion related to the Brass family?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
He's, one of the great champions of great industrialists in Bristol. Indeed, he is.
I thought
And
he
if
probably-
only, I mean, I've written it up, but it literally in 1788. It's much too early for the effective use of coal gas for any kind of lighting at all. I mean, bear in mind that the Gaslight and Coke Company didn't come into being till 1809. So, but that's very interesting. And they actually pay him 500 guineas. They take it quite seriously. And they go and see, and there are wonderful descriptions, but they simply can't figure out how they can make it a reliable source of light that will burn all night, every night, 365 days of the year, especially not in 1788.
Question here from Fred Starr. Presumably the light from a lighthouse could be seen by a ship when the top of the lighthouse appeared from just above the horizon. This must have happened in the days of coal fires, providing the air was very clear. The improvements were most beneficial under hazy conditions. And then it goes on with the coarse lighthouse. It looks like the second tier of reflectors are spherical. With the light at the focus, this is quite sensible. With the light has a physical size, when the light has a physical size, it would work very well for ships that were quite close.
Well, I don't think they were spherical, because actually, he's paying he's paying the Bolton Plate Company specifically for parabolic reflectors, and they supply it. So I think that is just a trick of the drawing, if you see what I mean. What else can you say? Can you say all that again?
With the coarse lighthouse second tier reflectors.
The thing about not being able to, red they all thought was the answer to, everything you would be able to distinguish. Of course, red's terribly difficult to see in fog. And all these lights, however bright and wonderful the beams are, fog has always been tricky. With red lights, it's much, much worse. But some of them, you can see them up to 15 miles away. They were pretty effective by their terms. I think, Fred, you might have to send me, would you like to send me that on an email, dear? Because that's very, very useful. Hello?
Yep, Fred's there. I'll make sure that we save the chat as well.
Yes, because actually this is exactly the
Fred's waving at you.
This is practically why I'm doing this, just to get some feedback.
And that's fine. I'm sure we'll get Fred to email that. There's no one here which leads on from what you were just saying there from Andrew Foyle. Has anyone done practical trials to test the effects of the various lens systems?
Well, when Fresnel lenses came in, that was all beautifully done in France in 1819, 20. But no, it was all terribly crude. Once it's in these early days, you're grinding thick bits of glass, which in fact Drummond was complaining about. God knows if the blown glass spherical reflectors, how effective that was. But really, it was. When Fresnel came in and he coupled up with an optician called Soleil. And in fact, I'm afraid you'll have to read my Fresnel lens paper, which is really how the technology caught up with the concept. Because when Fresnel was first building those lenses, and the first one is 1825, the glass technology lagged so badly behind that he's having to use a sort of hybrid system using, metal plates, which do, of course, take away too much from the light. And it wasn't until Alan Stevenson got together with Leonard Fresnel in the late 1840s that they did finally manage to produce an all-glass Fresnel lens that was really effective. So they weren't testing exactly. It was all, very sort of ad hoc, but they didn't when these lenses, when the Thomas Rogers lenses, they simply didn't have the technology in glass making in order to make the kind of beautiful lenses that you could in fact calculate and then cast, once you've done all the maths and then you made the molds so that, all of this kind of thing. We're really talking terribly early days. I'm not sure if I've answered the question. I think probably the answer is no.
It worked or it didn't. Yeah. In sort of terribly early days, here's a question taken even earlier. Do you know how the Roman lighthouse, this is from Matt Armitage, do you know how the Roman lighthouse in Deal was illuminated?
Before my time.
Presumably just a fire. But,
I'm sure just a fire. They used olive oil for lamps, but my guess it would be just a fire, but I say before my time.
Yeah, lovely. Any questions from in the room? I got one at the back there. I'll take this one first.
Can I ask about Bengal lights, why they're called that and how do they work?
Okay, the question was Bengal lights. Why are they called that and how do they work?
I'm afraid I didn't like. When I get home, I will send you the little chunk in the paper that tells you everything about Bengal lights, but I'm afraid I can't do it off the top of my head right now, this minute. This actually is the problem with this sort of thing. It is so detailed and there's so much new stuff that I write it down, I do all the work, and then I move on to the next, and then I can't remember what I've said. It's been quite interesting doing this, having to revisit some of it, but I'm afraid I didn't revisit Bengal lights very seriously because they were the only reason to have Bengal lights is to have Adam Walker come into the picture.
Sorry.
That's all right. No, but if you're seriously interested, of course, dear Christopher, I'll send you, you'll be glad to hear it's only 3 paragraphs, not 100,000 words.
John.
Just a couple of quick ones. My brother was a TV engineer, and I remember him telling me that actually white is a very bad kind of light. The best light that they use, for instance, for TV cameras, is a very, very pale blue called luminance C. Do you know our techniques say about red being useless, particularly in dog. Did anybody try blue?
Oh, yes, no, they did. Robert Stevenson, he tried everything. And they're trundling off to this hapless glassmaker in Turnmill Street called James Oakey. And of course, what's really interesting is that Robinson had got there first. So Robinson goes off and he goes round the glass people in London and they all say, oh, you'll never find anybody. No, there won't be a glassmaker in the whole of England that can make crown glass circles of 21 inches, whatever it was. No, hopeless. And he does eventually run to ground James Oakey, who's clearly rather sort of, interested. And so they have this back and forth, but he is doing red. And basically, you have to paint the red onto a sheet of white glass. And I've got all this written down and I can't quite do it off the top of my head. But red is a major problem because it's so far on one end of the spectrum that if you actually make it in the pot, it comes out black. So that actually you have to enamel it effectively on white glass, all of which is a major problem back in 1811 when Robert Stevenson goes off. He doesn't ask, he's so fallen out with George Robinson that he doesn't ask him who George Robinson got the coloured glass from. So he asks the people at Bolton and Watt, and they put him on to a whole lot of people in the West Midlands, all of whom write back and say, no. But he starts off with somebody called Eggington, and he wants green glass because he wants to be different from Trinity House, in my theory. He specifies green glass, and they go this argy-bargy back and forth. And then he does a lot of trials. I couldn't get all this in, so I thank you for asking the question. Robert Stevenson starts doing these trials on start point light using different types of coloured glass. And finally, the only one that is remotely effective is actually the red. And bear in mind, they're thinking of white glass or, whatever it's called. They can't imagine you either have white or you have coloured. You don't have any sort of mix in the middle, if you see what I mean. but he tries. He looks at green and blue, and there's a lot of information about it. And red is the only one that really works, even though it would be much easier to make green or blue glass because you can make it what they call in the metal. You can just put in whatever the metal oxide is into the material and turn and stir it in a crucible. You can't do that with red.
Can I just a quick follow-up? The wicks of these lights, I remember, and this is kind of off my subject and a bit of yours as well. One of the biggest biggest markets for cotton in the early days, when cotton was all fustian, which was a mixture of linen and cotton wool because the cotton was too soft. There was a big demand for cotton to make wicks for candles, hence candles. Did they use? Was there experiment going on making wicks, helping them to burn brighter?
For those who didn't hear the question was about the use of cotton for making wicks. Was there a big demand for that?
Well, as I understand it, actually somebody invented woven wicks, and I simply cannot at this moment remember the date. But they had woven wicks which lasted, I mean, if you just had fiber sort of stuck together and, and going with the oil, like all these early lights, it was not very effective. Somebody invented a woven wick. And I think these tubular wicks were woven. And in fact, the oil was fed to them from what they call a fountain, and it all goes, So once they started using Argand lamps, those woven tubular cotton wicks, I think, were just standard. And of course, bear in mind, which I didn't say, is the Argand lamp, I can only think of it in terms of lighthouses. It completely transformed domestic lighting for the neck till electricity came in. So I've got lots at home. I mean, they're all turned into electric lights now. But you see them in those rather pretty sort of decorative things where the wick goes. I mean, and Matthew Bolton, in fact, became the agent and I think bought the patent. I mean, Matthew Bolton, no flies on him. I mean, it completely transformed domestic lighting. And so I think in as much as anybody was doing any work on the wicks, and I think that it had been done by this time, but I may be inventing this, Matthew Bolton would have done it with the lighthouses. They were just sort of taking a lighting system that just became huge. Does that make sense? Sort of.
One more question in the room.
Comment, really. I've just finished the book on William Murdoch.
Oh, have you? Yes, he was their gas man.
He was gas man. I'm quite certain that John Champion was inventing lights with coal gas before William Murdoch.
Oh, no, he was. I mean, 1788 is absolutely before William Murdoch. I mean, that's what's really interesting about it. And it's also the reason it doesn't go anywhere, because although he understands the chemistry of it, if I can put it so, and what they can't do is to turn it into a controllable light source. Not at that period. Anyway, I'm afraid,
Lovely.
one of these, I mean, what I will do when I get, because the thesis is not a book, it's much too niche and peculiar, but I'm afraid it is going to be endless Newcomb Society papers till kingdom come. So one of these days you'll get all these questions answered.
I did say at the start that Julia could talk about lighthouses for much longer than we've given her time. There's a comment online here from Schmidt. It says, "What a brilliant talk. I have learnt lots." I've learnt lots as well. I think we'll all agree that's a very excellent end to our series of talks this year. So if we can say thank you to Julia once more. So I'll end the chat there. Great to see so many of you online. Do keep a note on other things that are going on in the Newcomb Society. There will be lots more talks over the summer. So good to see you. Hopefully I'll see you all soon again. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.